Human history is full of great ideas. We invented the wheel, electricity, the internet, and air conditioning. At the same time, we also spent a remarkable amount of time standing in front of mirrors and making decisions that probably should have been stopped by someone nearby. This is not a story about war or politics. It is about clothes, shoes, hair, and makeup. Things that were not always designed to protect or help, but to test how much the human body could realistically endure. From outfits that were dangerous simply by existing to designs that turned the human silhouette into a direct threat, this is a collection of decisions people once wore with complete confidence. And to begin, we start with the moment fashion decided that the female chest should double as a weapon. 1. The bullet bra appeared in the mid-20th century, when fashion reached the conclusion that the female chest was not drawing enough attention and needed to be upgraded into an emergency announcement. This was not underwear. This was a deliberate geometric structure. Two rigid cones were carefully shaped and aimed straight forward, as if actively searching for a target. The design was scientific in its own way. Every stitch directed force into a single point, making sure no softness survived the process. Worn under a tight sweater, the effect was immediate. The wearer entered the room. The cones arrived first. There was no confusion about the order. Fashion called it sexy. Reality called it impossible to ignore. This was not a subtle or accidental attraction. It was an architectural statement where the human body was redesigned to resemble an object capable of causing injury at close range. The bullet bra did not ask whether you wanted attention. It made that decision for you. 2. Before high heels became a normal fashion accessory, there was a time when height was measured not in centimeters, but in dozens of them. In 16th century Venice, platform shoes reaching up to 50 centimeters appeared as a very clear display of social status. The higher you stood, the richer you were, and if you could not walk in them, that only proved you were rich enough not to need to. These shoes were not designed for independent movement. Made from wood or cork, they were heavy, rigid, and completely uninterested in human balance. A noblewoman walking outside required two attendants, not for protection, but to keep her upright. Walking became a group project, where three people cooperated so that one person could move forward. Fashion called this elegant. Physics called it a mobile construction site. Every step was a fragile agreement between gravity and pride. But in return, the wearer never had to walk fast. Everyone could already see that she was standing very high. 3. There was a time when looking slightly anemic was considered a sign of refinement. European aristocrats did not just want pale skin. They wanted skin so thin it looked transparent, as if the circulatory system were part of the outfit. And when the body failed to cooperate quickly enough, they decided to add the details themselves. Blue veins were carefully drawn onto the neck, chest, and shoulders with light blue pencils. The message was simple. If people could see your veins, it meant you had never worked under the sun. You did not labor. You did not sweat. You stayed indoors and were served. Fashion called this delicate. Reality called it a partial anatomy demonstration. Instead of letting the body signal status naturally, the message was written directly onto the skin. No family tree was needed, no documents required. Just a blue pencil and complete confidence. This was an era when aristocrats not only displayed wealth, they displayed veins, even if they had to draw them on first. 4. In the early 20th century, going to the beach was a serious activity, and serious activities required serious clothing. For this reason, people decided that swimming should be done in thick wool garments, a fabric famous for retaining heat, odor, and water. On land, the outfit seemed fine. It was modest, respectable, and gave no indication that anything was about to go wrong. The moment it hit the water, however, wool did exactly what it was designed to do. It absorbed water. All of it. The swimsuit quickly became a soaked, heavy mass, pulling the wearer downward with the dedication of a professional anchor. Fashion called this a swimsuit. Physics called it a wearable water container. Swimming stopped being about movement and became an effort to avoid sinking, while the wool continued to expand by the second. Getting out of the water was the hardest part. Once the suit had absorbed enough water and decided to stay with you longer than expected. But in return, you could take pride in remaining modest, even while actively trying not to be drowned by your own clothing. 5. There was a time when beautiful eyes did not need to see clearly. They only needed to look unusual. In Renaissance Italy, women decided that the larger the pupil, the more attractive the gaze. And to achieve this, they chose a very direct solution. They put poison into their eyes. The substance was called belladonna, which translates to beautiful woman. It dilated the pupils instantly. The eyes became dark, deep, and slightly distant. Fashion called this enchanting. Medicine called it poisoning. Belladonna did not just make you look better to others. It made you see yourself. Vision blurred, focus weakened, and the heart began to race. But that was not the point. The goal was not to see the world more clearly. The goal was for the world to look at you longer. This was a period when beauty was prioritized over basic biological function. And if the price was not being able to see clearly, that was considered a reasonable expense. Belladonna did not make you blind immediately. It simply ensured that every moment of clear vision felt limited. 6. In a society where bad teeth were common, picking food from your teeth after a meal was a necessity. And when the aristocracy did something necessary, they found a way to turn it into a performance. That is how the gold toothpick was born. This was not a disposable wooden stick. It was made of gold, sometimes set with gemstones, and worn around the neck like jewelry. After eating, the user did not rush or act discreetly. They calmly removed the toothpick, brought it to their mouth, and began cleaning their teeth in full view of everyone. This action delivered several messages. First, I am wealthy enough to turn even the smallest object into jewelry. Second, I have just eaten a meal refined enough to require toothpicking. And third, I still have teeth to pick, which not everyone could claim at the time. Fashion called this refined. Reality called it an organized display. In that world, dental care was not just hygiene. It was visible proof of social status, performed directly at the table. 7. There were moments in history when people looked into each other's eyes and decided the main problem was that the pupils were not large enough. In Renaissance Europe, women wanted their gaze to appear deep, dark, and emotionally charged, as if they were constantly reflecting on art or personal tragedy. The fastest way to achieve this was to apply belladonna directly to the eyes. Belladonna was a poison. This was known. It also made pupils expand beautifully. A few drops were enough to make the eyes glossy, dreamy, and slightly unfocused. Fashion called this seductive. The body called it a warning. Vision blurred, light became uncomfortable, and seeing nearby objects clearly turned into a challenge. But the appearance met expectations. No one cared whether you could read or walk straight. The goal was to create a gaze that made others feel you were looking through them, even if you could not clearly see where they were standing. This was a time when people were willing to sacrifice their ability to see the world to appear more profound while looking at it. 8. Toothpicking was originally a private act. Once the aristocracy became involved, privacy disappeared. In Europe, the toothpick was upgraded from a small tool into a status accessory. It was made of gold, sometimes decorated with stones, and worn around the neck like jewelry. After a meal, this moment was never rushed. The user slowly removed the toothpick, held it where everyone could see it, and only then began using it. This was not simply dental hygiene. This was a statement. I have money. I have eaten well. And most importantly, I still have teeth. Fashion called this refined behavior. Reality called it carefully prepared showmanship. In a world without modern dentistry, having enough teeth to justify a toothpick was already an achievement. When that achievement was worn around the neck in gold, the message became unmistakably clear, whether anyone asked to hear it or not. 9. When skirts became too large to be considered clothing, people decided to turn them into structures. The steel cage skirt appeared in the 19th century as a solution to help women avoid wearing too many heavy layers of fabric. Instead of cloth, they used steel frames. The idea sounded progressive. It was not. The skirt expanded outward, forming a massive circular cage around the body. The wearer occupied the space of roughly 3 adults. Doorways required planning. Sitting down was a gamble. Strong winds turned the skirt into a public event. But the biggest problem was fire. Fire was everywhere at the time. Candles, fireplaces, coal stoves. The cage was covered in flammable fabric. One small spark, and the entire structure became a perfect trap. The steel frame held the skirt open. The fire spread. The person inside could not escape in time. Fashion called this elegant. Reality called it a design with an alarming fatality rate. The cage skirt did not just take up space, it took away the chance to survive. 10. There was a time when the higher the forehead, the smarter and more noble a person was considered. To achieve this look, medieval European women decided to deal directly with unnecessary hair. They shaved the hairline back. Further back. And if that was still not enough, they removed their eyebrows and eyelashes as well. The result was a wide, smooth, and unusually quiet face. No eyebrows to express emotion, no eyelashes to protect the eyes, just a neutral expression, whether you were happy, sad, or had wind blowing directly into your eyes. Fashion called this intelligence. The body called it missing parts. These women did not look surprised because they no longer had the tools to look surprised. They could not frown because there was nothing left to frown at. Every emotion was flattened in exchange for an ideal forehead. This was a time when beauty was measured by how much you were willing to remove from your face, and if sacrificing eyelashes made you look wiser, it was considered an acceptable cost. 11. There was a period when hair stopped being something you styled and became something you built on. In 18th century France, aristocratic women decided that wearing their hair was no longer enough. They needed a narrative on their heads. That narrative was often a naval victory, recreated in the form of a fully rigged model warship. To support the structure, hair was mounted on wire frames, padded with false hair, and fixed in place using pomade made from animal fat. To finish the look, flour was dusted over the entire construction. The result was heavy, sticky, and highly flammable, attractive in a way that invited accidents. Women wearing these hairstyles could not sit upright in carriages. They had to recline or lie on the floor. Doorways became obstacles. Candles became threats. But in return, you could claim that your head was a national event. Fashion called this the height of creativity. Reality called it a warship placed in the wrong location. And if the hair caught fire during a polite greeting, that was simply the cost of being an icon. 12. In the Middle Ages, social status sometimes had less to do with a person's height and more to do with the length of their shoe tips. Shoes with pointed toes reaching up to half a meter appeared as a very direct way to show how important you were. The longer the toe, the higher the status. This was clearly regulated, and if you could not walk properly, that was not a design flaw. It was proof that you had reached the appropriate level. These elongated shoes made walking awkward. The wearer had to move slowly, carefully, and with intention. In the most extreme cases, the shoe tips were tied to the knees with cords to prevent tripping. Walking was no longer a natural reflex. It became a planned sequence of actions. Fashion called this luxurious. Reality called it a wearable obstacle. But in return, no one looking at those shoes would ever assume you were in a hurry. And in that society, not needing to hurry was a very visible form of power, starting right at the tip of the shoe. 13. Losing teeth was a serious problem, especially if you were wealthy and expected to maintain a respectable appearance. Before modern dentistry, the most practical solution was to reuse someone else's teeth, more specifically, the teeth of people who had recently died on the battlefield. After major European battles in the 18th and 19th centuries, collectors would move through the fields and remove teeth from relatively fresh bodies. The teeth of young, healthy soldiers were considered high quality. They were sold to dentists, boiled clean, reshaped, and mounted onto ivory bases to create dentures for the upper class. Fashion called this a refined solution. Reality called it extremely direct recycling. The wearer could smile confidently at social gatherings without knowing that their smile had once been involved in a war. The teeth looked real because they were real. They just were not yours. But in that society, the origin of the teeth mattered less than the fact that you still had enough of them to smile politely. 14. While Europe was obsessed with white teeth, Japan went in the opposite direction. For centuries, blackened teeth were considered the standard of beauty, maturity, and moral character. Women, and sometimes men, deliberately dyed their teeth a deep black. The process was not simple. Iron filings were mixed with vinegar and herbs to create a solution with a memorable smell. This mixture was regularly applied to the teeth to form a durable black coating. The result was a jet black smile that strongly contrasted with pale skin and was considered highly elegant. Fashion called this refined. Outsiders called it confusing. But within that context, black teeth symbolized modesty and loyalty. They also helped protect teeth from decay, which was a practical side benefit. Still, the most important thing was the message. You did not need a bright smile. You needed the correct smile. And at the time, correct simply meant darker was better. 15. There was a time when hats were not worn for warmth or shade, but to deliberately limit vision. In the 1920s, the cloche hat appeared and quickly became a symbol of modern style. The design was simple. A bell-shaped hat worn low on the forehead, pulled down until the eyes nearly disappeared. When worn properly, a woman could only see the ground directly in front of her feet. Everything ahead existed as an assumption. To see farther, she had to lift her chin, creating a posture that looked confident but was actually an attempt to avoid colliding with street furniture. Fashion called this elegant, traffic called it dangerous. Cars were becoming more common, and walking turned into an activity based on trust. You trusted that nothing was approaching from the front because you could not check. In return, the hat gave you a very fashionable silhouette. Head down, chin up, eyes aimed at nothing. Fashion did not make you completely blind. It simply asked you to temporarily ignore whatever was happening in front of you. 16. Before gyms and protein powders became the standard, men had another way to look large and powerful. They stuffed their clothes. In Elizabethan Europe, the ideal male body did not come from muscle, but from the amount of material you could hide inside your outfit. Jackets and trousers were padded with whatever was available: wool, fabric scraps, horsehair, and in many cases, sawdust. The result was an exaggerated silhouette with a broad chest, thick arms, and a proudly protruding belly. The wearer resembled a carefully upholstered piece of furniture. Fashion called this strength. Reality called it difficult to sit down. The body became stiff, inflexible, and nearly impossible to bend. But that was not the point. The goal was not movement, it was presence. When you entered a room shaped like a mobile sofa, no one questioned your status. You might not fight, work, or dress yourself, but you looked like someone who never needed to. 17. There was a time when the face was not just for expression, but for announcements. In 17th and 18th century Europe, artificial beauty patches appeared as small but powerful fashion accessories. Cut from black velvet or silk, they were placed on the face to hide imperfections and to speak on behalf of the wearer. Placement was not random. Near the eye meant passion. On the cheek meant married. Near the mouth meant single and available. The face became a public notice board where personal status could be updated without speaking. Fashion called this refined. Reality called it a signaling system installed on the skin. Instead of conversation, people read faces. Instead of getting to know someone, they checked the location. And if you placed the patch incorrectly, the message delivered was not the one you intended. Still, in that society, using your face as a romantic map was considered progress. At least everyone knew what they were walking into before the conversation began. 18. Before fitness centers existed, men still wanted to look strong. And when the body failed to cooperate, fashion stepped in once again. In 18th and 19th century Europe, calves became a symbol of masculinity. Tight breeches and silk stockings left nowhere to hide. So men began buying calves. The pads were made from fabric, wood, or cork, and strapped directly to the lower leg, then covered by stockings. The result was a pair of legs that looked solid, balanced, and entirely unrelated to reality. Walking remained the same, only the outline was upgraded. Fashion called this enhancement. Reality called it supported confidence. No one pretended the muscles were real. No one said it out loud either. In that society, looking like you could run, fight, or ride a horse mattered more than actually being able to do it. Men did not need to train. They just needed to attach the correct accessories in the correct places and let imagination handle the rest. 19. There was a time when pale skin was not just a beauty standard, but proof that you did not work under the sun. To achieve the ideal shade of white, European aristocrats chose a very direct solution. They applied lead to their faces. The mixture was called cosmetics. In reality, it was finely ground heavy metal mixed with vinegar. When applied, the effect was immediate. Skin became whiter. It also became drier. Then it cracked. Then it ulcerated. To cover the damage, more lead was applied. The cycle continued. The consequences appeared slowly and consistently. Hair fell out, teeth decayed, bodies weakened. Some people became paralyzed. Some did not go much further than that. Fashion called this a sacrifice for beauty. Medicine called it lead poisoning. At the time, appearance mattered most. If your skin were white enough, the rest could be addressed later. And if it could not, at least you had looked correct the entire time. 20. There was a period when social status was measured by the height of a hat. In 15th century Europe, tall conical headpieces nearly a meter high appeared on noblewomen as mobile landmarks. The taller the hat, the higher the status. This was easy to understand and difficult to carry. The hat was secured firmly, often with a long veil trailing behind. Wearing it required balance, patience, and acceptance that standing fully upright was no longer an option. Doorways became obstacles. Ceilings became a constant concern. A slight forward bend became the default posture. Fashion called this graceful. Reality called it a spinal adjustment for style. The wearer did not bow out of humility, but out of geometry. In return, no one ever confused your rank. In that society, bending for life was considered a reasonable price, as long as you were bending from a sufficiently elevated position. 21. There was a time when beauty was defined by how far you could go without actually walking. In China, foot binding began when girls were as young as 4, when bones were still soft and had not yet learned to protest. The feet were bent, the toes folded underneath, then tightly wrapped every day until growth stopped. The goal was very specific. The smaller the foot, the more beautiful it was considered. The ideal size allowed only short, slow, painful steps. Walking stopped being a means of movement and became a demonstration of endurance. Women moved carefully, not because it was graceful, but because there was no alternative. Fashion called this refined. Society called it status. A woman who could not walk properly proved she did not need to work. She became a living ornament for her family. A lifetime of pain was considered a reasonable cost for beauty. And if being beautiful meant not being able to walk straight, then standing still was treated as a valuable advantage. 22. Wigs were once symbols of elegance until they developed ecosystems of their own. In 17th and 18th century Europe, wigs were made large, tall, and fixed in place with animal fat. The fat held styles very well. It also held everything else. Lice and fleas quickly realized this was an ideal environment, warm, dark, and rarely washed. Mice did not completely object either. Wigs became temporary housing for small creatures with ambitious plans. Wearers sometimes felt itching, sometimes they heard movement. Removing the wig to investigate, however, was considered improper. Fashion called this status. Reality called it high-density housing. People chose discomfort over admitting that their heads had additional residence. Because in that society, the worst thing was not having animals in your hair. The worst thing was being seen with your real hair. And if sharing living space with small mammals preserved your image, it was considered a perfectly reasonable compromise. 23. There was a time when a cane was more than a walking aid. For 18th century European aristocrats, it was a chance to prove you were prepared for any situation, even when no situation had been requested. That is how the multi-purpose cane came to be. On the outside, it looked polite and harmless. Inside, it was a compact storage unit. Some concealed slim swords for moments when honor required attention. Others contained small flasks for morale recovery. Some included telescopes for theater observation, writing tools for sudden inspiration, or small devices for unclear purposes. Fashion called this refined. Reality called it anxiety wrapped in wood. The owner walked calmly while holding a combination of weaponry, alcohol, and surveillance equipment. The message was clear. I am not just walking. I am prepared for anything that might occur on the sidewalk. And if nothing happened, at least I had something impressive to pull out during conversation. 24. There were moments when fashion did not aim for harmony, but deliberately split the human body in half. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, two-toned clothing appeared as a way to display loyalty and lineage. One color on the left, another on the right, assembled onto a single person. The design was not subtle. It was very clear. A tunic with blue on one side and red on the other. Trousers with each leg a different color. The wearer resembled a walking emblem, presenting a family color chart with every step. No introductions were needed, no questions required. All information was evenly distributed. Fashion called this individuality. Reality called it nowhere to hide. When you dress like a living flag, you are identifiable from a distance. That helps if you want attention. It is less helpful if you want to leave unnoticed. But in that society, being seen always mattered more than comfort. And if sacrificing balance proved where you belonged, dividing the body in two was considered a perfectly reasonable choice. 25. When mustaches became a source of national pride, daily activities had to adapt. In the Victorian era, men spent serious time curling, waxing, and shaping their mustaches with the dedication of an engineering project. The problem appeared at tea time. Steam and liquid had a habit of undoing the entire structure. The solution was the mustache cup. A curved porcelain guard was built into the rim, forming a barrier between the hot drink and the carefully maintained facial hair. The drinker raised the cup, placed the lips precisely, and kept the mustache completely safe behind the shield. Tea passed through, style remained intact. Fashion called this refined. Reality called it personal protective equipment for facial hair. Drinking tea became a precise operation requiring alignment and posture. In return, a man could enjoy his beverage without sacrificing appearance. In that society, inventing additional tools to protect mustaches was considered progress. And if drinking tea through a porcelain barrier preserved dignity, it was seen as an entirely acceptable sacrifice. 26. Eye makeup used to be a risky experiment. In the early 20th century, mascara was not a carefully engineered product. It was usually a mixture of grease and ground coal. The formula was simple. The effect was immediate. The consequences were immediate as well. When dry, the mascara stayed in place and made lashes look dark and defined. When exposed to water, it melted with unnecessary enthusiasm. A raindrop, a bit of sweat, or a brief emotional moment was enough to send the black pigment on a journey. Instead of highlighting the eyes, it charted its own path down the cheeks. Fashion called this seductive. Reality called it an unintended visual effect. The wearer was not crying. The face was still melting. Every rain shower turned a walk into a short horror film. At the time, looking good in dry conditions mattered more than looking stable in all conditions. And if emotions had to be expressed through black streaks on the face, that was considered a reasonable price for bold lashes. 27. After steel cage skirts occupied all available space in front and on the sides, fashion decided there was still potential in the back. That is how the bustle was born. The goal was clear. Concentrate all visual mass at the rear and turn it into a deliberate structure. The bustle was not fabric. It was a framework. Made from steel, wire, or horsehair padding, it was strapped directly to the lower back. The dress draped over it and immediately formed a flat, wide, stable platform behind the wearer. Stable enough to look like it could hold a tea set if necessary. Fashion called this the ideal silhouette. Reality called it rear architecture. The wearer could not lean against chairs. Sitting required strategy. Turning around required radius calculations. In return, you gained a shape no one could ignore as you left a room. The bustle did not celebrate the body. It redesigned it to include a usable surface area. And in that era, resembling a piece of mobile furniture was considered entirely reasonable. 28. Some societies looked at a newborn's head and decided it was only a rough draft. The rest needed editing. In many ancient cultures, cranial shaping was treated as a serious investment in the future. While bones were still soft and had no objections, infants' heads were wrapped, pressed with boards, or secured in frames to gradually elongate them. The process was slow. It happened daily over the years until the skull reached the desired shape. The child grew up with a long, narrow head that was impossible to mistake. Not to think better, not to be stronger, simply to be different. Fashion called this status. Society called it nobility. An unusual skull proved that your family had the power to interfere directly with biology. You did not need to explain your lineage. Your head did it for you. And if carrying a permanently curious skull structure proved your background, it was considered a perfectly reasonable price for social rank. 29. There was a time when having two separate eyebrows was seen as a lack of commitment. In ancient Greece and Rome, beauty favored a single, continuous brow stretching across the forehead like a unified statement. If nature did not comply, people stepped in to complete the design. Charcoal was ground for color. Glue or tree resin served as an adhesive. For those who wanted extra realism, goat hair was trimmed and added for thickness. Everything was carefully applied to the space between the brows, turning two individuals into one collective form. The face immediately appeared more serious, more thoughtful, and intentionally less expressive. Fashion called this intelligence and purity. Reality called it facade editing. A unibrow made you look like you were constantly contemplating profound matters, even if you were just waiting your turn. And if glue and animal hair were required to prove intelligence, that was not excessive. It was in compliance with the standard. 30. There was a time when hair stopped being an accessory and became a construction project. In late 17th and 18th century France, hairstyles grew taller each year until height itself became a logistical concern. These structures were built on wireframes, packed with false hair, fixed with animal fat, and finished with powder. The result was hair so tall that wearing a hat became impossible. Doorways turned into tests. Carriages required posture adjustments. Candles became hazards. Styling grew so complex that hairdressers were no longer called hairdressers. They were called architects. Fashion called this the peak of creativity. Reality called it building on a human head. Hair no longer just expresses style. It announced status, leisure, and the ability to stand still for hours while others worked around you. And if a hairstyle required structural engineering, flammable materials, and an exit plan, then at that time it was not excessive. It was the standard of greatness.